Welcome back. We're on Chapter 11 this week, and we're going to be focusing on crimes against children. Now, the objectives during this module of instruction is going to be that we recognize types and patterns of burns injuries found in child abuse, define and discuss shaken baby syndrome, define Munchausen syndrome by proxy, identify the types of child molesters and explain investigative and interview techniques for cases of child molestation. We're going to define and describe human trafficking, especially as it relates to child sex trafficking. We're going to understand the relationship between child pornography and sex tourism. We're going to outline the types of child pornography, discuss the use of computer and the internet in child pornography, discuss additional ways that the internet is used to exploit children, be able to differentiate between sudden death syndrome and physical abuse, understand what sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, is and its misconceptions, discuss the prevailing theories in SIDS research, understand criminal homicide as a possibility in SIDS deaths, describe the profile of infant abductors, outline the assessments and investigative procedures used to determine whether a child has absconded or has been abducted, discuss sex offender registration and community notification laws, describe the personality traits and behaviors of individuals inclined to commit school crime, and then understand the role of law enforcement in school crime. So let's begin. Probably no other crimes are more emotionally laden than those involving children as victims. Police officers and investigators often speak of the intense emotion associated with viewing innocent children as victims of crime. Unfortunately, incidents of crimes against children or crime against children have increased dramatically during the past decade. Today, their prevalence seems to be have reached epidemic proportions. It takes little effort to find reports of child abuse and assault in the newspapers, on television, and from other media sources. As a result, increasing numbers of police departments have investigators who are assigned exclusively to the investigation of crimes against children. For this reason, this chapter focuses on issues of child abuse and assault, including some of the techniques and problems associated with investigating these crimes. Crimes perpetrated against children can appear in many forms and contexts. Children may experience abuse, for example, the results in burn injuries, and yet deliberate burning often goes unrecognized. It is especially important in such cases the investigators establish a good rapport with the hospital workers and particularly emergency medical technicians, who will probably be the first person to see the children or child's injuries. After discussing burn injuries, this chapter explains shaken baby syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy, two crimes that have recently received much attention. Next, the chapter addresses the investigation of sexual crimes against children, such as molestation and incest. The investigation is one of the saddest experiences in any officer's career, and few officers are able to complete it without some feeling of anger and remorse, particularly since, in many cases, these crimes are committed against children by their own parents or guardians. Also discussed in this chapter is infant abduction, another crime that is on the rise. In regard to older missing children, strategies are provided for use by the investigators to determine whether a child has been abducted or has run away. Next, child pornography, a crime that is rapidly increasing due to the facilitation by the internet, will be discussed. This chapter concludes with the sections on sex offender registration and the crimes in schools, including overviews on the threat assessments and the personality traits and behaviors of troubled children who commit crimes in schools. So let's begin. Assaults against children is the most common cause of children's death is physical abuse, often by their own parents. The clinical term commonly used to describe physically abused children is the battered child syndrome. Now, abuse of children takes various forms, from minor assaults to flagrant physical torture. Although abusers use a wide variety of instruments, the two most common are the belt and the electric cord. Now, looking at burn injuries and child abuse for a moment, we have what we call the typologies of burns. Children may incur various types of burn injuries. A burn may be classified by how severe or deep it is and by how the injury occurred. So we have the medical classification of burn severity. This is where physicians primarily categorize burns as having either partial thickness or full thickness. Now, some of the causes of burns just depends on the object used. The severity of a burn is also directly influenced by the circumstances which cause the burn. Scald burns occur when the child comes too close to contact with a hot liquid. Contact burns can occur when the child encounters a hot solid object or even a flame. Now, looking at unexplained child fatalities, we have a term we mentioned earlier called sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. The sudden and unexpected death of an apparently healthy infant that remains unexplained after the performance of a complete autopsy is known as the SIDS case. Now, the police officer's role is when the law enforcement officer serves as the key role in the SIDS case and is often the first person to encounter the shock, grief, and guilt experienced by the parents. Is this a homicide? There's always a possibility. Some studies raise the specter that in recent years there have been cases in which children had actually been murdered, but the deaths were incorrectly classified as SIDS. Moving on to another part of this component is the traumatic brain injuries and death. Now, most child deaths are directly related to injuries that are a result of the specific act of hitting, striking, or physically abusing the victim. What we call the coup or counter-coup injuries, from the French word from head of coup, injuries, are observed in the direct site of the impact of the head in a moving object. Shaken baby syndrome. The mechanism of injury. Shaken baby syndrome, or known as SPS, is a severe intentional application of violent force or shaking in one or more episodes that result in the intracranial injuries of the child or to the child. The mechanism of injury in SPS is thought to result from the combination of physical factors, including the proportionally large cranial size of the infants, the laxity of their neck muscles, and the vulnerability of their intracranial bridging veins. So some of the indicators that we see and symptoms is that crying has come under some increased scrutiny as a stimulus for abusive activity. Because shaking is generally a response to crying, a previously illness causing irritability may increase the likelihood that the infant will be shaken. So some of the investigative guidelines we look at is in injuries or deaths of young children, investigators find radiologists, physicians who specialize in the interpretation of x-rays that may be especially helpful. Another type of crime we're seeing that's on the rise is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Now, Munchausen syndrome is a psychological disorder in which a patient fabricates the symptoms of a disease or injury in order to undergo medical tests, hospitalization, or even medical or surgical treatment. In cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or MSBP, a parent or caretaker suffering from this symptom attempts to bring medical attention to him or herself by injuring or inducing illness in their own child. Investigative guidelines. A partial list of investigative guidelines can include that you consult with all experts possible, including a psychologist. Exhaust every possible explanation for the cause of the child's illness or death. Find out who had exclusive control over the child when the symptoms of the illness began or at the time of the child's death. Now, shifting gears for just a moment, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about child sexual exploitation. First, we're going to talk about child molestation. It's what we refer to as situational child molesters. The situational child molester does not have a true sexual preference for children, but engages in sex with children for a variety and sometimes complex reasons. Regression or regress is an offender usually has low self-esteem or poor coping skills and may turn to a child as a sexual substitute for a preferred pure sex partner. We have what we call morally indiscriminate. For this individual, the sexual abuse of a child is simply part of a general pattern of abuse in his or her life. Sexually indiscriminate, that although the previously described morally indiscriminate offender often is a sexual experimenter, this individual differs in that he or she appears to be discriminating in his or her behavior, except when it comes to sex. And then we have what we call the inadequate. This pattern of behavior includes those suffering from psychosis, eccentric personality disorders, mental retardation, and/or senility. The second category is what we call preferential child molesters. Now, the preferential child molesters have a definite sexual preference for children. The first one would be seduction. This pattern characterizes the offender who engages in children in sexual activity by seducing them, courting them with attention, affection, and gifts. Introverted. This pattern of sexual behavior characterizes the offender who has a preference for children but lacks the interpersonal skills necessary to seduce them. Then we have the sadistic. The pattern of behavior characterizes the offender who has a sexual preference for children but who, in order to be aroused or gratified, must inflict psychological or physical pain or suffering on the child victim. So how do we interview or start the interviewing process of a molested child or children? Now, common sense and formal research agree that children are not merely miniature adults. We know, for example, that children develop in stages during which they acquire capacities for new functions and new understandings. So number one, we have developmental issues. Waterman has identified 3 types of development issues that are important when allegations of sexual abuse arise. Number one, first, the child's developmental level relative to other children in his or her age group. Second, is the child's developmental level, what is the child's developmental level with regard to sexuality? Third, is the child's ability to respond adequately to interviews and to testify in court there? So things we'll use and tools we'll use, for example, are anatomical detailed dolls. When an anatomical detailed doll, male and female dolls with body parts, including the genitals, were first introduced in the late 1970s, they were widely hailed as almost universally adopted by child-serving professionals as an important advance in techniques for communicating with troubled children. Then we moved into drawing interviews. Now, one alternative that's been used by some police agency, either in connection with or instead of using an anatomical doll, is to have a child draw his or her own picture and then explain what happened. Asking leading questions, as with anatomical dolls, leading questions are widely used as a courtroom technique to assist child witnesses. Now, what are the child's reactions to victimization? Well, there are a few things in our society who would argue that child sex abuse does not cause serious problems for its victims. Sexually abused children syndrome is one. Early attempts to describe a sexually abused child syndrome were quickly discarded as lacking a foundation in empirical research. Today, however, some of the leading researchers and clinicians in this area or field are moving toward a consensus of behavioral indicators of sexual abuse. What about the risk of false allegations? A recent spate of highly publicized sexual abuse allegations has caused the public to recoil and question the limits of credibility. Emotional reaction to the pedophile. Because many investigators themselves are parents, they react strongly to the pedophile. However, for legal and pragmatic reasons, such feelings must never translate into physical or verbal abuse. Now, we've talked about child molestation. Let's spend a little bit of time going over child pornography in this section. Commercial child pornography is that which is produced and intended for commercial sale on the open market or the black market or on the internet. Homemade child pornography, contrary to what its name implies, the quality of homemade child pornography can be as good, if not better, as the quality of any commercial pornography. Now, what is the use of child pornography? Now, we have what we call use of child pornography collections. Although the reasons why pedophiles collect child pornography and erotica are conjecture, we can be more certain as how this material is being used. Child pornography and children erotica are used for the sexual arousal and gratification of pedophiles. A second use of child pornography erotica is to lower a child's or children's inhibitions when they watch it. A third major use of child pornography collection is blackmail. The fourth use of child pornography erotica is a medium for exchange. And the final one is the use of collateral material, which is profit. So we have to understand that all of this has created a huge market on the sex tourism. We also use computer and the internet child pornography. Basically, the use of the computer and by the extension of the internet, it's an unfortunate asset to the child pornographer. Many child pornographers are compulsive record keepers. And for them, the computer as a cataloging tool is an electronic gold mine. Child pornographers can acquire additional materials through the instant contact with other pedophiles. In addition, the home computer provides tools that make it easy to store, retrieve the names and addresses of accessible victims. Also, the pedophile may use the computer to directly establish a rapport with the victim. So now let's focus our attention on those crimes or internet crimes against children. Cyber enticement through social sites, instant messaging, email communications, and gaming connections can lure an unsuspecting child into sexual contact with a pedophile. Two things we need to be cognizant about is bullying and cyberbullying. Bullying is loosely defined as aggressive behavior, intentional harm by an individual or group repeated over time that involves an imbalance of power. Cyberbullying is simply using the internet, cellular phone, or other technology to harass another person. What about child abductions? Now, child abductions are also on the rise, and we start out with the parental interview. It is critical that parents be interviewed separately from each other and from other family members and reporting parties. The investigator must balance this objectively with empathy and support if the parents are in a state of emotional crisis. When we look at the victimology of the missing child, we have to understand that whether a child's absence is consistent with the established patterns of behavior, meaning they're a frequent runaway, officers must first understand the child's normal actions before the disappearance. Officers should use guidelines for assessing the personality of the missing child. Then we focus our attention on abduction patterns. Now, the data from these cases bring to light certain offender characteristics, such as motivation and planning. The motivation, although little research exists on the topic of infant abductors' motivation, the cases outlined in this chapter illustrate that the need to present their partners with a baby often drives the female offender. Planning. We look at some abductors spend a great deal of time planning their crimes, others apparently acted on impulse. And there are published checklists for law enforcement to use We also have what we call the Amber Alert Plan. Now, the Amber Plan is a voluntary partnership between law enforcement and broadcasters to activate an urgent news bulletin in the most serious child abduction cases. Broadcasters use the Emergency Alert System, or EAS, formerly known as the Emergency Broadcasting System, to air a description for the missing child and suspected abductor. One of the things we look at when we use the Amber Plan are time factors. Now, these are statistics that indicate that the majority of runaway children cannot sustain an absence for more than 2 weeks from home. And finally, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sex offender registration and notification. In 1994, Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexuality Violent Offender Registration Act. Now, the act required that states create sex offender registries within 3 years at the time or lose 10% of their funding under the Edward Bond Memorial Program. The Pam Lyncher Sexual Offender Tracking and Identification Act of 1996 amended the Jacob Wetterling Act by establishing a national sex offender database which the FBI maintains. So the registration requirements is that although sex offender registration requirements vary according to state laws, some common features exist in the registries across the country. For example, a state agency or state police maintains the registry for the entire state. We also have notification features. Now, the most basic form of notification, sometimes referred to as the passive notification, allows inquiring citizens to access registration information at their local law enforcement agencies. In addition, these forms have passive notifications as a number of states allows government agencies to disseminate information about registered sex offenders to vulnerable individuals and organizations. Now, using this process of active notifications, officials may choose to notify prior victims, landlords, neighbors, public and private schools, child care facilities, and religious and youth organizations, and other relevant individual agencies. So how does all this tie together? Well, the last section of this chapter we're going to talk about real quickly is crime in schools. In an effort to develop a systematic procedure for threat assessment and interventions in school violence, cases from the FBI's National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime included an in-depth review of 18 school shootings. As a result of the threat assessment intervention, a model was developed. Now, the threat assessment rests on two critical principles. Motivation is the first one, and motivation is a threat that may be a warning signal, a reaction to fear of punishment or some other anxiety or a demand of attention. Then we have the signposts. The path toward violence is an evolutionary one with signposts along the way, and we look at the levels of risk. We have a low level of threat, a threat which poses a minimum risk to the victim and public safety. We have a medium level of threat, a threat which can be carried out although it may not appear entirely realistic. We have a high level of threat, a threat that appears to pose an imminent, meaning immediate, and serious danger to the safety of others. So when we look at this, we have to consider the factors of a threat assessment, all right? And the factors of a threat assessment basically boil down to four items in the chapter. We have the specific plausible details that are a critical factor in evaluating the threat. Second, we look at the emotional content of a threat that can be an important clue to the threatener's mental state. Third, we look at the precipitating stressors or incidents, circumstances, reactions, or situations that can trigger a threat. And then we look at the predisposing factors, thus the underlying personality traits, characteristics, and the temperament that predispose an adolescent to fantasize about violence or act violently. Then we have to focus on the personality traits and behaviors, such as leakage, low tolerance for frustration is analyzed, poor coping skills, lack of resiliency, failed love relationships, injustice collector, signs of depression, narcissism, alienation, dehumanizing others, lack of empathy, for example, exaggerated sense of entitlement, attitude of superiority, exaggerated and pathological need for attention, externalizes blames to others, masks the low self-esteem, anger management problems, intolerance, inappropriate humor. They seek to manipulate others, lack of trust, closed social group, change of behavior, rigid or opinionated, unusual interest in sensational violence, fascination with violence-filled entertainment, i.e. video games and movies, negative role models, behaviors that appear relevant to carrying out the threat. These are all basic classifications we look for, or characteristics we look for in someone who might fall into this category. So when we look at the classification of threats, we have to analyze the type of threats. Now, number one, there's a direct threat that identifies a specific act against a specific target and is delivered in a straightforward, clear, and explicit manner. Then we have what we call an indirect threat that tends to be vague, unclear, and ambiguous. A veiled threat is one that strongly implies but does not explicitly threaten violence. A conditional threat is the type of threat that is often seen in extortion cases. Therefore, we look at the role of law enforcement. In the vast majority of cases, the decision on whether to involve law enforcement will hinge on the seriousness of the threat, whether it's low, medium, or high. And low levels is a threat that has been evaluated as low level, poses a little threat to the public safety, and in most cases would not necessitate a law enforcement investigation for a possible criminal offense. Medium level, when a threat is rated as medium level, the response should in most cases include contacting law enforcement agencies as well as other sources to obtain additional information. High level, almost always if the threat is evaluated as high level, the schools should immediately inform the appropriate law enforcement agency. So how do we go about investigating school violence? When we're investigating threats of violence in schools, it is important to listen carefully to witnesses in order to correctly identify the level of the threat and subsequently take appropriate action, such as who made the threat, who received the threat, what were the circumstances surrounding the threat, what words were said, and how often were these threats being made. We may have to go back to the suspect's home and look for weapons. A number of planned school shootings and bombings around the nation have been successfully averted because of home searches. Items to be considered when conducting a home search would be armed officers, parental consent, search warrants, multiple weapons, and of course you want to avoid publicity when possible.